And welcome everyone. Welcome. I know you all are trickling in, so we will give a minute here for everyone to join us. Wherever in the world you are, we want to welcome you to today's event. We're really excited to have you. I'm so excited to be here with this incredible group who you're going to meet in a moment. And we want to thank you for sharing your time with us today, whether it's the morning where you are, or the afternoon, or the evening. So we'll go ahead and get started. If we haven't met before, hello, my name is Chelsea. For the benefit of anyone with a seeing issue or a disability, I am a blonde woman in my 30s, we'll just go with 30s. And I'm wearing a green sleeveless shirt, and I'm sitting in my sitting room with a colorful photo on the wall and a sofa behind me and some plants behind me as well.
So we have that post there.
And
Now we also
by
have to recreate the
profession
post
and by really
in
heart's work, I
um,
am the executive
in
director of Eat,
DCSD
Breathe,
News.
Thrive, which is an
So
organization
we're going to do that.
dedicated to helping people recover from eating
We're going to
disorders.
clone another
And I'm
post like
really
I did
honored today to
before.
be co-hosting this discussion
Um,
with my friend Matt and the Institute for
Copy the
Patients'
title once
Rights.
again.
He also is the director of the
Update
Patient
that
Rights
URL.
Action Fund. So
Thank
over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Chelsea. I'm Matt Valier,
And
Executive Director
then
of the Institute for Patients' Rights and the
I had
Patients' Rights
actually just
Action Fund.
copied
We're an
that, and we're going to
organizational
keep
group
that learn more
dedicated
in
to
this one
protecting
now so that
the
people
rights
can
of
be directed
patients
to the principal profiles
for
page.
the gold standard of end-of-life care, and
Sometimes you still need
therefore
to do a little bit of extra
oppose the
styling.
legalization of assisted suicide and
Going to remember
euthanasia
to put that sentence in
public
the
policy. So
summary
I'm
here. Put the
I'm
start date.
a man of
It's the
color in
23rd.
my early 40s, dark wavy hair. I'm clean shaven
And
today.
again,
I've got an olive
we're going to use that
complexion. I'm
same
wearing a
photo.
purple
So it should already
checked
be uploaded.
shirt that's
Here we
buttoned
go.
up and a dark blue blazer.
People on a Hulk
Um,
ride. All
so
right.
I just wanted
I'm going to
to
click update there.
let kind of
All right. And now we're going to cross our fingers that it
with
shows up
a
everywhere
overview
that
of
we want
what
it
we'll
to.
do today,
Okay.
and
So
then
now
with
hopefully
Chelsea,
that
and then
should
I'll
look a
kind of take
bit
a few
better. There
housekeeping
we go.
items and we'll get started.
All right, but of course, as always, reach out to me with
Excellent.
any questions. I'm also happy to do
All
this.
right.
It's
Well,
super quick, so
by
hopefully
way
this
of
video was helpful.
overview, I mean, first, we just want to thank you for being here with us. We're here to discuss the serious risks that assisted suicide laws pose to people with disabilities and eating disorders. And even as I say that, I am aware that the line between eating disorders and disabilities, as we'll discuss today, is not always that thin. You know, we're not always talking about two different groups there, if we ever are. I think it's really important to remember that all mental health conditions are disabilities. And far too often, people with disabilities, whether they're mental disabilities or physical disabilities, are denied the health care and the support they need by the very systems that are meant to support them. We're also here today because of a study that I was really honored to co-author with my colleague, Dr. Catherine Cookatone. And that study looked at assisted death specifically in eating disorders. And it's really part of, I think, a growing awareness that in many countries and states around the world, we're seeing these very systems that are failing to provide care also offer assisted suicide and present it as a treatment for the suffering that they are perpetuating. So that's really kind of the framework we're coming to this conversation with. We are really privileged. I'm very excited to have 4 speakers and advocates here with us, in addition to Matt and I, who will be sharing their insights. And they are people who have not only made this their professional work, but they also have lived and living experiences in disability rights, mental health, public policy, eating disorders, and healthcare advocacy. I'm really excited about this particular conversation because I think it's an opportunity for our communities to learn from one another. You know, I've worked in the eating disorder community for a long time, and I've been so grateful that each of the humans here today and the organizations that they've represented have been in this conversation about assisted death and assisted suicide for a lot longer than I have. And my hope with this conversation is to bring some of their insights to folks who may be newer to this conversation, as I was when we started our study. We're really eager for our communities to learn from one another and just to explore all the ways that we can work together to protect the rights and dignity of people with all disabilities. And on that note, I just want to give you a quick overview of our speakers, and then I'll hand it to Matt. We are here today with Diane Coleman. Diane is the president and CEO of Not Dead Yet, an organizational plaintiff in a case in California, and a national disability rights group, which she founded in 1996 to give voice to disability rights opposition to legalization of assisted suicide and euthanasia. Anita Cameron is the director of minority outreach. She's also from Not Dead Yet and has been a disability rights activist for nearly 40 years. She's also an ADAPT organizer. I believe, Diane, I remember hearing from you that you came up in ADAPT as well, if I remember that correctly. Jules Good is the program coordinator for the Autistic Self Advocacy Network and the founder of Neighborhood Access, focused on building accessible communities. And Natalia Hicks is the director of community justice and health equity at Inclusion Canada, with a focus on intersections of disability and mental health. So the one thing I will mention that maybe is not clear in their bio is that we have an international group here, and you will hear that in even our language and how we talk about this issue. So Natalia's from Canada, Diane and Anita and Jules, I believe, are in the US. I'm in the UK, Matt is in the US. I'm American by birth, so I'm fluent in all of the language. And I know many of you are joining from around the world. So if you hear us using different language, that may be part of what's going on there. We'll try our best to bring that to light in the conversation itself. Over to Matt.
So just a few housekeeping items. We'll take all questions via the Q&A function. So if you move around your cursor, the bottom toolbar should show up. If you do not see two little bubbles with Q&A, the letters underneath them, then click the furthest right button that says More with 3 dots, and the Q&A function is among the list there. So you can ask your questions in writing via the Q&A function. If you are a journalist, it would be helpful to understand which outlet you're coming from. So if you wouldn't mind typing that in as well. The session will be recorded. We will share the link on our platforms afterwards. I believe Eat, Breathe, Thrive will be the main host for that. For panel and hosts, anyone who's not speaking, please do keep your mic on mute. And for any of our participants, if you can benefit from closed captions, you can turn them on by, again, going down to the toolbar. If you don't see the CC button, if it doesn't show up there, then again, the furthest right button is 3 dots with More, and you'll see an option there, or there will be an option there that says Captions. You can click it and click the Show Captions button on the next set of options. And then again, for if you can benefit from sign language interpretation, you just click similarly on the toolbar, the button that says Interpretation, and select American Sign Language. We have both live ASL interpreter and live closed caption people assisting us today. So we're really grateful to them. Thank you both for joining and for helping us make this webinar as accessible as possible. I think that's all she wrote. So Chelsea, do you want to ask the first question?
Sure, thanks, Matt. Yeah, we want to get into the topic of assisted suicide and euthanasia, but before we do, I want to zoom out a little bit because I mentioned it at the beginning that sometimes eating disorders and disability are talked about as if they're completely separate issues. So I want to give this question to Jules. Jules, maybe you can share a little bit about your background and how you come to this issue, but can you share a bit about your thoughts on the nexus between eating disorders and disabilities and how these conditions intersect to impact individuals' lives? And again, feel free to share how you're coming to this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Quick visual description of myself. I'm a white person with short, I don't know what color it looks like on this camera. It's pink in real life hair. Wearing big glasses, sitting in my office at home. Yeah, so I am someone who is multiply disabled. I'm late deaf, I'm autistic, I have chronic illnesses, all kinds of fun stuff. And I also am a few years into recovery from an eating disorder. I think it's important to recognize that, and I'm coming from a place of speaking about US law. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, which, as many know, is kind of one of the big laws that protects disabled people in the United States. The way that it defines disability is basically any significant condition that significantly impacts your ability to perform one or more activities of daily living. And that's maybe a broader definition than what most people think of or what comes to mind when we think about disability. But under that definition, if we think about activities of daily living, feeding ourselves, communicating, sleeping, being able to get out of bed in the morning, being generally like aware and feeling okay. Eating disorders impact all of that significantly. And that's also why we consider mental health conditions also to be under that disability umbrella. And so when we're talking about like eating disorders and disability, there's the kind of discussion of eating disorders as a disability. And then there's also the discussion of how does having an eating disorder impact someone who has other disabilities, and what is the interplay of your disabilities and your eating disorder. So for me, I know like when I was at my sickest with anorexia, it was really hampering my ability to care for my other chronic illness symptoms. And because I was seeing, multiple doctors who weren't talking to each other, I was getting feedback on what to do from my chronic illness specialist that was not cognizant of my needs as someone who was like really struggling with an eating disorder. And so it's important to recognize that there's like layers of intersectional identities there. And I know we'll probably dive into this more, but that becomes even, more complicated by our experiences in the medical system that are informed by race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, all kinds of things. So yeah, there's a lot of interplay between all of it.
Thank you so much, Jules. I think you hit on so much in such a short time. So I really appreciate it. And I, the only thing I'll also add is also eating disorders can lead to disability. So I know in our study that there were multiple people that were disabled, physically disabled as a result of their illness, unable to walk, unable to leave their house, bedridden. So there's, as you said, multiple layers. Is there anyone else that wants to weigh in there before Matt asks the next question?
I could offer a contribution. And before I do, I'll give you a little positionality on me. Again, my name's Natalia. I'm a director at Inclusion Canada, which is the organization that advances the human rights and full inclusion of people with intellectual disabilities and their families across the country. I'm also in my 30s, similar to Chelsea, and I'm queer, and I'm learning and exploring my relationship with disability the more I learn about disability and disability rights and disability justice. So what I wanted to contribute to this question is that we have statistics in Canada that show that 4 out of 5 people who self-identify as having a mental illness also self-identify as having at least one other type of disability. So it really does statistically show up that there is a lot of overlap between these populations. I would also kind of back what Jules is saying, that we do tend to think about mental illness and disability as separate. And in reflection, I think part of that might be that our tropes about disability and our tropes about mental illness conflict with each other. So kind of maybe a challenge for us to reflect on that. And I'll also say that the Canadian assisted suicide laws, we call it medical assistance in dying legally in Canada. So you might hear me mention the acronym MAID. MAID assisted suicide, kind of interchangeable here, but our laws differentiate from disability and mental illness, and people's accessibility or whether or not they qualify for MAID depends on whether or not they are seen to be mainly a person with a disability or mainly a person with a mental illness. But I think it's important for us to recognize that the people with disabilities who are eligible to die by MAID in Canada, many of them also experience mental illness. So again, even in the law, it's not as cut and dry as we sometimes think about it being. So thanks.
I'm really glad you weighed in there, Natalia. And there's so many layers of this. And I as you're speaking, I was also thinking, the tropes, but also even the term disability carries a huge amount of stigma in today's society. So, I was aware in our pre-conversation that part of the resistance there may actually be, in kind of internalized bias and internalized stigma. So I think that's important to know. Anyone else want to speak before we go to our next question? All right, Matt, that's your cue.
Yeah, how do you all view the dangers that assisted suicide and euthanasia laws pose to people with all disabilities? So, have in terms of your personal and professional experiences, as you consider how those things have shaped your perspective on these issues, but like I think some people could question how certain particular disabilities are at play here with this particular conversation, and why and how these public policies do impact everybody across the board. And so we're kind of like to explore that a little bit.
I guess perhaps I could say something about how I came to this, but I'm always still learning, and actually this effort to connect has really, been a big part of that. I'm Diane Coleman with Not Dead Yet, an older white woman with short gray hair, a breathing mask, glasses, wearing a red dress and sweater. My history goes back to the 1980s, before assisted suicide was really on the public radar. But at that point, some disabled men went to court saying, get me out of this nursing home or stop treatment, kind of give me liberty or give me death. And this was written up a lot about it in court, because it was court cases, very public within the disability community, press and so forth. And the outcome was they got death. So this was really disturbing. I mean, the language was that their lives were meaningless and not worth living. And shortly after that came along, for those who are in the US, you would probably have heard of Dr. Death Jack Kevorkian in Michigan, but not everyone has, I'm sure. But he was assisting the suicides of people with terminal illnesses and not terminal illnesses, and getting very, very popular, covered in the media as, you know, some kind of a maverick hero. And it really felt to the disability advocates at the time who'd been following the issue just like a steamroller, rolling us over, and the risk felt very high. And we saw that the issue was being framed as one of compassionate progressives versus the religious right. And we had come out of a protest background fighting for home care with the ADAPT group that I know Anita will talk about a bit more. But we certainly didn't feel like we were part of the typical opposition to assisted suicide. It was really awkward. But at that point, we felt like we really needed a street action group, and that's where I started Not Dead Yet. We were already experienced fighting for home and community-based services, not having to go to institutions. We did sit-ins, we did rallies, we had signs, protests, occupation of offices, and so forth. And applying that to the Kevorkian situation, we helped get him convicted and taken off the streets. We looked at him as a serial killer of people with disabilities. And we also, by doing that, brought the disability concerns into the public eye. So finally, you'd see that we were mentioned in news coverage from time to time. But it took a number of years to get that to happen. And when I think about it in terms of your situation, if you want to do direct action, I don't know, the thought comes Dr. Gaudiani out in Denver, be a great location for a rally or, you know, occupation of whatever you felt like. But I know people don't do direct action quite as much anymore, but it just can't help but think about it. So we proceeded doing work to educate organizations and get them to take a position on the issue. The disability community is not monolithic about this, but in terms of the organized community, I would say, over 15 national disability organizations in the US have taken a position opposed. There's no major national disability group that has taken a position in favor. And many of the state and local affiliates of those national groups also work with us, and we can reach out through disability networks to take action within individual states, which is where most of the policy battle is going on at this point. And, when I think about the different strategies that people, have engaged in to move this issue, there's scholarly research, there's outreach, personal stories, media work, building organizational support. And I can see already that you all have been doing that, and I think it's great work. And so I think at this point, it'd be good to just turn it back to Chelsea and Matt for further input, and looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
I just want to say thank you, Diane, for giving that history, and also just frame this for those in the eating disorder community. When we published the study, I've never done any advocacy work before in this. I mean, when I was a little girl, we went to the legislature and campaigned for gay rights. And that was because I had two moms. But other than that, I was 12 years old. I haven't done anything like that. And when Matt connected me with Diane and Not Dead Yet, Diane was one of the first people to give me an enthusiastic yes and connect me with others, and has really, I mean, in as close to a literal sense as you can, been a trailblazer in this area. So I feel really privileged to be in this conversation, and also just want to say thank you for the work you've done over the past 20 years. And, you know, I've said it before, but this is a complex issue, and it takes sometimes a little bit of time for people to understand all of the complexities around it. And there's a lot of misinformation. So thank you for laying that groundwork. It's made our work in eating disorders a lot easier. And you know, I'm just gonna what you said yesterday, Natalia. You know, you said it's a big tent, so come on in. You know, there's we're not really separate communities here. So I'm really grateful. Are there others that maybe want to answer that question around, you know, the dangers that this poses to the to our collective communities, and also, you know, maybe you have some history you want to share.
I can contribute again, but I just want to make sure, Jules or Anita, if you want to contribute, that you have lots of airtime as well. So I will defer to the two of you. Does anybody else have anything you want to contribute, or should I go?
Anita hasn't spoken yet, so if she
Yeah.
wants to give me the chance. If not, that's okay.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you well.
I'm Anita Cameron. I'm director of Minority Outreach at Not Dead Yet. I am a Black woman with caramel colored skin, very long locks, and I'm actually wearing a pink and black t-shirt, and that says Not Dead Yet, the resistance. I come from an activist background. My first protest was at the age of 5 in kindergarten, protesting about getting lunch that day. I joined peace and justice movement at the age of 16 because when I was 9 years old, I said I wanted to make the world a better place for all. So at 16, I joined several social justice movements, culminating in LGBTQ rights and justice and disability rights and justice. At the age of 21, I did two things. I came out as a lesbian and I joined ADAPT 3 years after the founding of ADAPT. I have been involved in this social justice for 43 years, and ADAPT 38, 39 years. My background is in protests, organizing protests, organizing vigils. I've been arrested 140 times in 40 years. And I think that it's almost like I don't even know why there seems to be a difference, if you will, between folks with, I will say I live with depression. And so I have mental health, been in and out of hospitals and whatnot way back in the day. And I guess I never really separated. To me, folks that have mental health disabilities and folks that have eating disorders, to me, all are in the disability category. Certainly in the United States, all of us enjoy protection under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I think that we're natural allies, and I hope to do more work, in the future, with y'all. Living in Rochester, New York. We're in Western New York, and we're less than 90 miles from Canada. I have a history with Canada. I lived in Canada at several points in my life, and actually at one point wanted to immigrate to Canada until they started doing um, assisted suicide, euthanasia. Um, I decided no, there would be no way, because you can't even trust your doctor in a situation like that. And unfortunately, there are folks here in the United States and groups who want it to be like in Canada. So I'm going to leave it at that to say we're natural allies, and I'm looking so much forward to working with you all. Thank you.
Yeah, I think just to speak to the initial question of like, how does this actually pose a risk to disabled people? And we're including our eating disorder community in that for the sake of this discussion. The idea that some suicides are okay if they are done by somebody whose life we don't think is worth living is unconscionable. We have a lot of resources, not enough, but a lot of resources in the United States that go to suicide prevention. And the fact that the concept of assisted suicide / medical aid in dying has been uncoupled from suicide is a deliberate move on the part of the people who want this to be the legal reality. And the issue with it being a legal reality from a policy perspective is, regardless of how you feel about an individual person's ability to make a choice about this, there are widespread implications for people who do not have the privilege of choice. And what I mean by that is, the more disabled you are, the more marginalized you are, the less access you have to healthcare resources, the less choice you really have. People who haven't been in a situation where they've been denied care because a doctor won't listen to them, people who haven't been in a situation where they've had to make a choice between paying rent and getting medication, it can be tough to face the reality that our medical system severely disenfranchises people who do not have money and means. And one of the most dangerous things about passing these laws is that it shepherds people who are already in a position of vulnerability in our medical system toward death instead of towards treatment. Anita, go ahead.
And I'm going to piggyback on that to say, I don't know how it is in Canada or other parts of the world, but here in the United States, if you are not white, your ability to get access to medical care and all it is limited. There are many, 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 many studies here in the United States on those disparities, particularly with Blacks. And so, oftentimes, so I've been saying for the past 7 years that as this assisted suicide push is normalized in our country, right now we have 10 states in the District of Columbia that actually have those laws. They're going to, as we normalize this, we're going to see more and more people from marginalized communities being pushed into or coerced into or slid into, this assisted suicide because our lives tend to be devalued. And so, not only the more the more severe your disability is, the more complex your support needs are. Race also factors in to that. And unfortunately, myself, I can tell you many, many, many stories about how race has affected me being able to get the health care and things that I need. So, Jules, I just wanted to, add that important thing that here in the United States, race plays a big part in what you get as far as um, resources and healthcare and all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How you're treated by doctors, how you're treated in the emergency room, how you're treated by healthcare professionals and all. It factors greatly in it.
In addition
Yeah.
to the systemic realities, right? So like when we were doing research for the lawsuit that Diane mentioned, which if people want to learn more, it's at just endassistedsuicide.org. I had a conversation with these doctors, ER doctors, who serve at hospitals in LA County that serve underprivileged communities. And they said, well, we both have worked at these other hospitals that are the best hospitals in the county, like UCLA and Cedars-Sinai, where they literally do not have, you can't get into the hospital outside of valet parking because there's just no public transport access to these places. If you're coming in an ambulance, if you're coming from the wrong zip code, they keep their ERs so full that if you're coming from the wrong zip code where there's low or no reimbursement rate, they just send you on to the next hospital. If you're coming from the right zip codes, quote unquote, yeah, they transfer somebody up, they admit them to the hospital, and then they receive that new patient. Well, guess what? All of the zip codes that they're moving along to the next hospital, those are all the black and brown zip codes, and vice versa. The ones that they're receiving are all the white zip codes. So it's like it just makes your head explode. Anyway.
Yeah. I want to throw in, it's not a planned question, but it's related. And one, I just want to say, Anita, thank you for bringing that up, and Matt for pointing out, all of the different, the fact that this is not happening in a it's not happening in a perfect system, but far from it. It's happening in a system that is replete with inequities and problems and harm. Sometimes when I'm in these conversations, some part of my head can hear the people who completely disagree with what's being said, and I want to ask you a question along those lines, because I hear it so often, and I hope some of you can speak to it. Natalia, it might be a good one for you. You're a systems thinker. Anita and Jules, as you were speaking to the real harms and the real risks that these laws pose to marginalized communities, people with disabilities, there will be people who are listening to that and go, yeah, but what about all of these people that it can benefit? And they feel like they should have choice. They feel like, but if somebody's terminally ill and they want to be able to end their life, who are you to take away their right? So I wonder if you can speak a little bit to this idea of one person's freedom granting the ability to harm countless others. And anybody can take that.
Yeah, I can try, Chelsea. It really is the heart of this. And in the intellectual disability space, we often talk a lot about special choices for special people. And some examples of that would be the choice to go work for no pay all day long, right? You can choose to go and do like a workplace training program where you're not paid, or the choice to go live in an institution that puts limits on your rights and how you can navigate your day-to-day. So those are choices that we have throughout history offered to people with an intellectual disability on the basis of their disability. And generally speaking, in society, we don't support the choice to die by suicide. Like that, generally speaking, is the norm. In Canada, people with disabilities can die by MAID, even if they aren't nearing their natural death. The language of the law is that their death is not reasonably foreseeable. So we started at a point where MAID was completely prohibited. It was against the law to support a person to die by suicide, and then introduced MAID for end of life situations. And now we've moved to a point where MAID is both available to people at end of life, in end of life conditions, and people not at end of life conditions, provided that you have a disability or disabling medical condition. So we've arrived along this long road to this point where we're offering special choices to special people, right? We're giving the special choice to die by suicide to people on the basis of their disability status. And I guess for me, that's just not worth it. Like like giving people the autonomy to choose well, it's tricky because it's not it's not the same. The choice of choosing how you die if you're already dying, and the choice to die is a different choice, right? Like how to end your life and if you end your life are two different choices. And in Canada, we're at the point where people are choosing if they die. So I think we just need to be aware of that, and that's kind of the trajectory that we're on.
I would also just add to that, in that slot, where in that vein of thought, whether it's a terminal, quote unquote, terminal illness or not, which is a very mushy definition in these public policies, is that there are lots of people who supposedly qualify and are getting lethal drugs who aren't terminal. So here in the US, the statutes are very clear to have a 6-month or less prognosis, but a lot of people fall into that bucket that most people wouldn't even realize, even to the extent that somebody recently decided to starve themselves for 48 hours in order to get approved for assisted suicide drugs. So to be clear, like going back to the multiple crossovers of communities, when some people are left with, this is supposedly supposed to add autonomy, but when killing yourself with a doctor's help is the only choice to which you have equal access, I'm not calling that autonomy. I'm calling that eugenics. And especially when every single person and the only people who qualify for help with killing themselves are people with disabilities, and the people who get suicide prevention as a matter of course are people who are lesser disabled or non-disabled.
And this, Anita, there's such thing as false choices. Come on, I'm sorry. As someone who was going to be sent to a sheltered workshop when I already had college degrees, I'm sorry, but there are such things as false choices. If your only choice is between a nursing home where you're going to die or killing yourself, is that a choice? You mentioned the choice, like with people with intellectual disabilities, the choice between going, working all day for a job and getting nothing and getting paid. A lot of time, come on. What that tells me is somebody talked that person into thinking that it was good to work all day and not get paid. So sometimes what you say are choices aren't really choices. And so there isn't, when you come down to it, there are no carve outs. There are no people for which assisted suicide is a good idea. There simply are not. They talk about this choice and this autonomy and all, when there really are no choices. That's the thing. You can't tell me that, okay, the choice to go into a nursing home or kill yourself. When I come from my dad background, I almost rather die than go into a nursing home. You know, um, as someone who just had to break out of a nursing home, you know, that's not a real choice between that and dying under any of these, whether it's assisted suicide, whether what goes on, in Canada or not. And the proponents who push this, it's really not because of pain, it's really because you don't want to be disabled. And so when you already start out in life and having a poor attitude, toward disability, and the whole thought of I'd rather be dead than disabled, and lots of people think like that. There is no choice, and assisted suicide is never good for anyone. I'm sorry, I'm going to say that until assisted suicide is not good for anyone, for any group of people. What we need instead of assisted suicide is proper end of life care, which is not assisted suicide. That's getting the services and supports that you need while the dying process takes place. Assisted suicide, rather than getting, the proper services and supports that you need as someone with a disability. That's, the answer is fight for more pain relief, fight for better health care, fight for all of this. Don't fight for assisted suicide, because as that gets normalized, I don't know what's going on in Canada. It wasn't 2023 the first year that y'all was supposed to get. I suspect that in Canada, a lot of this is affecting a lot of vulnerable people, a lot of marginalized people, a lot of like First Nations or not white people. I don't know, because it seems like when injustice happens, it's happening to marginalized people. It's not happening to those with the privilege. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you, Nick. That was excellent. Oh, I was going to go to you next, Diane. So you've
yeah,
taken it.
I guess I just wanted I wanted to focus for a minute on the fact that proponents of legalizing assisted suicide are often acting as though suicide and assisted suicide are the same thing, or in effect that people who want to, end their own life can't do it without being assisted. But the point, and Natalia, you had just made this, is that assistance is being provided only to some people. And in the beginning, when this was hot in the 90s, the Surgeon General in the United States came out and they pointed out that the rate of, quote, failed suicide attempts that don't result in death, was very high. Like, I think it was 16 out of 17 attempts do not result in death. So the idea that certain people who are ill need help to do it, well, that's not necessarily logical either, because there are other ways. But the fact is that the general public also quote, needs help to do it, if it's really about autonomy. And that's obviously not what's happening. People are being assigned to a category where we're going to make sure they don't have the opportunity to fail like everybody else. Because, so often we know that when people make an attempt and fail, there's a reassessment of something can change in how they feel about proceeding going forward. But nowadays, the proponents are heavily promoting the right to refuse right to refuse food and fluids, or VSID, voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, as a method of ending one's own life. Or even if you do it for 3 days, in some places now they're talking about that'll be enough to bridge you to getting lethal drugs. So I think there's a lot to think about, but what the statutes really do isn't about enabling one to end one's life. They're legal immunity statutes that protect medical providers and other persons who assist someone to end their life. It's not about that person, it's about protecting those people.
Thank you, Diane. I really have to draw an underline around what you said. You know, these laws actually grant rights, and not rights, even legal protections to physicians who or other healthcare providers who prescribe lethal drugs. Jules, I see your hand up, and it's really good because I was going to ask a quick. I was going to draw a parallel and ask you a question. So I might ask you, and then feel free to take it in a different direction. I want to draw the connection between what Diane was just speaking to and what Anita was speaking to before it. You know, there's between our two communities, if you even see them as separate, which they're not, we're talking about people who, if you're listening and you're in the eating disorder community, we know that getting access to care is very, very difficult. And the more marginalized you are, the harder it is to get access to care. So what's concerning is you have a system that's denying people access to the care and the support that they need, whether that's healthcare or housing or employment rights. And then on the other hand, saying we can help you in your suicide if you're suffering. You have lived experience of all of this, Jules, and I think you speak so eloquently to it. So can you speak to some of those parallels and that dynamic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this ties in with something I wanted to say in response to what Anita and just this whole discussion. A question that I will often rhetorically ask people who are trying to tell me that this is purely a bodily autonomy issue and that I have no right to interfere in their individual choices is, who is too disabled to have rights? Who do you decide is too disabled to have rights and to make choices? Because once you draw that line, you are always going to be discriminating against a group of people. And there's simply no way around that. And I think I bring that up because we are simultaneously seeing people trying to push for a policy that gives people the quote unquote choice to die in a system that has almost never given people equal opportunity to live, much less thrive and live an enjoyable life, right? So it's really a bad policy decision to make it easier for people to die in a system that you're already allowing to kill a lot of people and disable a lot of people. And I think that in the way that I think this translates in both, you know, specifically the eating disorder space and other disability spaces, is often our choices, unless we come from independent wealth or have a lot of privileges that a lot of people don't have at their disposal, our choices in how we receive our care come down to insurance. And the way that insurance treats eating disorder treatment sucks, because on a lot of plans, you get one try at treatment, and if you fail, then they won't cover it again. And that's if you even qualify under the incredibly restrictive guidelines that insurance companies have to determine who is sick enough to get treatment for an eating disorder. So when I was getting treatment, I had to kind of like DIY a bunch of things together because I couldn't get admitted into a facility that took my insurance because my BMI was too high. Even though I was like having heart problems, my hair was falling out, my skin was gray, my fingernails were like falling off. Like I was very sick. And none of that was enough because my height to weight ratio told them that I clearly can't have an eating disorder. So that's like an eating disorder specific example. And we see that in other places too, where maybe you have someone who has an intellectual developmental disability, trying to get mental health care to stop self-injury, right? Like if the way that their self-injury presents doesn't fit into a super narrow criteria of what insurance deems is quote unquote bad enough, they're not going to be able to get help in a lot of cases. So we've created a system where it's like you already have to be really, really, really having a bad time in order to get any help. And there's hardly any preventative resources that are available to people who are either experiencing milder sickness or are, you know, somewhere else on that spectrum of illness and disability. So I think what's like important to recognize as well, the other thing I wanted to say is that, like, yes, there are people that you're going to talk to who simply will not give you the time of day and don't want to listen to you about why this is a systemic policy issue. I do think that in my experience advocating around this, like I just helped defeat a bill in my state this past legislative session. And one of the biggest things I learned is that a lot of people just don't know. They've never considered it from a disability perspective before. They don't understand how this policy interacts with the medical industrial complex, with insurance, with all of these other systemic inequities. And once you explain that to them, especially policymakers who ostensibly have the best interest of their constituents at heart, they will at least hear you out and understand how this could cause more harm than good. There are always going to be people who just won't listen no matter what. And this is the case in any type of advocacy work, right? The best place to start is like the middle. And once you get those people in the middle, like on your side, then you can start working on some of the people who are a little bit further on the spectrum, a little bit further, right? And so I think that's like, it's while we're saying like drawing a lot of attention to the fact that there are people who just will never like see eye to eye with us on this issue, there are also a lot of opportunities and resources for educating policymakers and community members to at least get them to concede that this has the potential to be extremely harmful to the most marginalized people in our communities.
That's a great segue. And Natalia, I might throw this question to you. It's an audience, I think we moved to audience questions, and I think it might give you an opportunity to speak to something else here as well. And it's a really good segue from what you've just spoken to, Jules. So one of our audience members here is from Not Dead Yet UK. So in the organizing, just as you were, fighting a bill, fighting a proposed assisted suicide law coming to Parliament in November, and I've heard whispers of sooner. I'll just say, so active here, and I'm wondering, do you have? So this person is asking, do all of you have advice that have already from countries that have already had assisted suicide laws in place for those of us who are fighting to prevent it from happening here? Anything you know now that you didn't know when you were opposing the law from being introduced where you are? Let's go to Natalia first, then we can open it up.
Sure. That's a pretty huge question. I do think that, okay, so the process of resisting Canada's ever expanding medical assistance in dying legislation has been pretty brutal, I will say. And one of the things that's been the most difficult for me from where I sit is just like watching people with disabilities participating in these legislative processes, sharing their stories, sharing their concerns, and being like so intentional about what they say, knowing that this is not going to be popular, that it contradicts people who think that they're being really a really critical thinker, pushing this medical assistance in dying legislation through. So they're being so intentional. And they're showing up and sharing their stories and sharing their fears and their experiences and being completely dismissed in the process. And I want to kind of make 2 points about that. One of them is, as you're preparing to like participate in this, some like self-care measures are absolutely necessary, some community support so that people understand that when they are dismissed, it is not a reflection of them as a human and the words that they chose or the tone that they used, that they're being dismissed because of ableism. And I think another related point is that when these assisted suicide laws are passed, they are further entrenching the ableism that makes people disrespect people with disabilities in these processes. And so we've to this point in this conversation, we've largely talked about the people who are eligible for MAID, but Matt a while ago asked how MAID laws affect all people with disabilities, and they affect all people with disabilities because they further entrench that ableism and the devaluation and the view that life with disability isn't a life worth living. So yeah, I guess as you're engaging in this, get ready to care for yourself and get ready to see being dismissed as a systemic, because it is pretty painful to watch.
I think too, you have depends on where the law goes, right? So we're kind of curious as to where proponents will try to expand the US versions of the laws next, because they continue to make attempts to expand. In Canada, where it seems like things just keep outstripping sorry to say that it's on the bleeding edge, and where, you know, somebody with, although they've kicked the can down the road on euthanasia for purely mental health, you could still get it, right? So if you have any disability whatsoever, any condition for which you subjectively do not want to live under it. So there are people, I mean, multiple news reports, not just one, where somebody's under the duress of grinding poverty and they're requesting euthanasia and getting it, and who knows what their, it could be even a fairly, whatever disability they have, if they feel as though it is a condition that they cannot live with, don't want to live with, then they can get approved for euthanasia, concomitant with like acute clinical depression or something like this, right? So we're in a spot where, you know, I believe it was in, Natalia, you can correct me, but as I read this story, as a young man had acute clinical depression for years. He was something like 19 years old, ended up blind in one eye, and was approved for euthanasia. And this is where this goes. And that's why this can and does and will impact and affect everybody with disabilities. And if you don't necessarily consider yourself a person with disabilities, depending on the perspective you're coming from, you might actually be somebody with disabilities, but that's a different question altogether anyway.
Well, this Anita and the whole, you know, if you can think about, you know, the disrespect of being poo-pooed, you know, for disability. Imagine the disrespect of being poo-pooed when you add race to that. Because they're not even thinking about that. And I'm talking about people with disabilities who happen to belong to other marginalized communities, particularly Black and brown communities. You know, add that on there, you know. And that's the thing here in the United States, because we're not yet seeing, you know, the effects of assisted suicide on marginalized communities, because here it's mostly white and wealthier, but the statistics around insurance are telling us that here it's starting to hit poor people. As this as this normalizes across the United States, that's where we're going to see the marginalized communities, particularly disabled, particularly Black and brown communities, and poor communities getting it. Because I think we're already starting to see a little bit of the poor, in the United States. But you can't tell me this doesn't affect people with disabilities, and you can't tell me this doesn't affect communities of color and other marginalized communities. And no, we're not monolithic, but the outright dismissal is not good. Thank you.
I know, Chelsea, you're trying to move on to another audience question. Really quickly, Anita, I wanted to say that in Canada, because we do have these two tracks, we do have different data on each track. And the data is not great. You're correct that it wasn't until 2023 where they started collecting data on racialization and indigeneity in class and things like that. But they are collecting data on gender. And we are seeing in track 1, which is for people whose death is reasonably foreseeable, that it's mainly men. The majority are men. And if you're looking at track 2, for people whose death is not reasonably foreseeable, it is the majority are women. And I think that stat is kind of a clue for us as to what's happening. And it also is reflective of data on people who complete suicide versus attempt suicide, and women are known to be more likely to attempt to end their lives, and that's concerning when we think about how track 2 is mainly women. I'm very eager to see how the other markers of marginalization show up there, not because I'm hoping to see them, but because I think it's really important that we are aware of how people are showing up.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you answered that, Natalia. And also I'll just say, in our study, we of the cases of assisted suicide and eating disorders and euthanasia and eating disorders, the ones that had case details, 100% were women, all of them. So there is a huge gender disparity there. I also just want to briefly just say to that point, the question that was asked, and I think we have time for one more question about the UK law. One piece of advice I might share is that in the UK and in many countries and states that are considering these laws, they hold up the Oregon model as this emblem of safety. See, safeguarding is possible. We can do this. And it speaks to another question that's been asked. Our study found massive gaps in oversight. We found that cases where people with eating disorders had been assisted in suicide were not identifiable in the public record. I can't say that loudly enough to the parliamentarians here, to the MPs here. It looks safe, whatever that means on paper, but that's because the cases are not being reported in the public domain. There's no public scrutiny there. So if we didn't have a physician who wrote a paper about it and told everyone that she was prescribing MAID to people with eating disorders, these cases may never have been found. So it's really important. We do not have evidence of safety. Final question, if it's okay, I think it's a good one for Diane. And Diane, you'll have to be brief, but I think you can do it. This is a question from Alexander in Washington, D.C. at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Could you discuss how the term assisted suicide euthanasia turned from a form of suicide, as recognized by the Supreme Court, into a medical procedure somehow distinct from suicide?
I'm not sure I even think that's the case. So it's not something I've given thought to.
You have seen, though, Diane, you've been in this for 20 years. You've watched how organizations, lobbying organizations, have come in and tried to shape public opinion. So I think you would agree that.
Well,
have you seen have you seen those efforts
you
over
mean,
the past 20 years?
Are they played with the language? Yes, forever they've been doing that. Yeah, absolutely. Right, medical aid in dying does sound so nice. And they have wanted to take the word suicide out of it because of the stigma that's attached to that. But and I think there's been a lot of cooperation with that in the media. But one thing we can look to in the US at least is that the American Medical Association, the big physician lobby, has stuck with physician-assisted suicide after long debate as the language because they feel it's more precise. So their analysis of that could help some people in improving it.
This Anita, I think because I approach this from, as a Black disabled queer person, I can almost see how that went from, particularly suicide to an end of life care treatment. I could see this, especially when the NAACP, and most of us know the NAACP is. That's a big organization, around Black folks. They actually went into partnership with Compassionate Choices and on healthcare. I'm actually going to meet with someone top end at NAACP on getting rid of that, on ending that. That is where I saw it go from just, a purely suicide thing to now we're treating this as end of life care, healthcare, medical care, and all that. I saw that when they made, I think it was in 2018, 2019, they made Compassionate Choices entered into, kind of a deal with NAACP on that. That's where I first saw it. And that's where I first saw that they were going toward this end of life thing. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We're kind of at the end of our time. We could stay on for a little bit if people want, but I want to respect everyone's time here, both here on the panel and all of you attendees. It's a very deeply personal and difficult issue to wrestle. There's no kind of question about that. As we navigate this as a public policy, I think it's important to recognize the difference between the moral and ethical implications of somebody taking their own life and how a public policy affects certain groups of people. So at least for us in our organization, we simply don't take any position on the former, only the latter, right? And that's because tough cases make bad law, no matter what you think about whether or not the morality or ethical implications of the act. So I'm gonna just end there with a little bit of information. I know that for some people, the talking about suicide at all can be a trigger, and I just want to make sure that everyone, if you may be in crisis, that there are options available to help you to cope. At least here in the US, you can call or text 988. It's the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Anytime you can connect with a trained crisis counselor, and for confidential support available 24/7 to everyone. You can learn more at 988lifeline.org, just for people who may need that. Again, thank you so much for your time. And Chelsea, I feel like you could close it out for us.
Thanks, Matt. I just don't want to forget to say thank you to our exceptional ASL interpreter, Corey, who's been with us this entire time. And I know we've gotten at least one request to have Corey's information. So I see you in the chat. I also just want to thank you all for being here and let you know that this event is part of a larger series of events that we're doing completely spontaneously after this study to bring people together to have conversations just like this. So you can see the past events. Melanie's going to send you an email afterwards with the recording for this event. And there's 3 events in the series you can watch. And then we've got 2 more coming up. One on supporting families whose loved ones are having a really hard time getting care and maybe thinking about assisted suicides and knowing that this is not an individual issue, but it affects families. And we have another event coming down the pipeline, which hasn't shown up on our website yet, looking at the really difficult ethical issues involved in this topic, and have some really smart people that are coming together for that. So I can't wait to bring them together. I want to thank all of our panelists and also just encourage you to connect with their organizations. Not Dead Yet, which has chapters in the US and Canada and the UK, the Autistic Self Advocacy Network with Jules, and Inclusion Canada with Natalia, all doing amazing work and really just great leaders in this field. So thank you all. And then we will hopefully see you again at a future event. Melanie will be in touch. And I'll just say, for anybody struggling with an eating disorder, we have free courses that run every single month, and good crisis intervention services to connect you up in your local community with crisis services. So we're here for you in addition to the hotline that Matt mentioned. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.